A chamber that is like a reverie, a chamber truly spiritual, where the stagnant atmosphere is lightly touched with rose and blue. There the soul bathes itself in indolence made odorous with regret and desire. There is some sense of the twilight, of things tinged with blue and rose, a dream of delight during an eclipse. The shape of the furniture is elongated, low, languishing. One would think it endowed with the somnambulistic vitality of plants and minerals. The tapestries speak an inarticulate language, like the flowers, the skies, the dropping suns. That was the beginning of a prose poem called The Double Chamber by Charles Baudelaire. We'll talk briefly about that piece of writing today alongside two other pieces by Baudelaire. One is called Be Drunken. The other one is called Exotic Perfume. Before we do that, I just want to recall some of the themes we talked about last time in a poem by Paul Verlaine called Longueur, and another piece by Baudelaire that we talked about called The Counterfeit Money. Basically, we talked about how both of these pieces express differently themes of decadence, which we discussed at the beginning of the last video. You can check that out if you forgot about the idea of decadence, but basically it's a concept that was popular in the mid to late 19th century in discourses about literature and art, and it was based on the idea that society and social mores or morals were in decline. And it's briefly, it names themes in literature that play with that idea that we live in a morally corrupt, bankrupt society. These themes were expressed in Verlaine's poem, for example, in notions of idleness. Remember, he was sitting around writing a poem while the barbarians were attacking the Roman Empire. Also notions of luxury and notions of ennui, boredom. We also talked about the counterfeit coin in relationship to decadence, specifically figures of artificiality or falseness or duplicity, which can be found in the counterfeit coin that Baudelaire's narrator's friend gives to a beggar on the street. And we saw how Baudelaire describes the so-called moral gesture of charity being corrupted, going bankrupt, if you will, by the counterfeit, the nature of the counterfeit coin that was given to the pauper in the story. So we talked about various themes relating to decadence last time, and we'll pick up with a few more related themes today, mainly the one having to do with intoxication. This is kind of related to the idea of idleness and luxury, and also, ennui and boredom as well that we talked about last time. And we could probably see a point of connection or similarity between these readings in the idea of tobacco, which you will remember from the counterfeit money. The two friends had just left a tobacco shop. And I figured I would just really quickly read a paragraph of what the French philosopher Jacques Derrida says when he's talking about this story in his book, Given Time, and when he's specifically analyzing the figure of tobacco and its relationship to the story. So he writes, "Apparently it is the object of pure and luxurious consumption. It appears that this consumption does not meet any natural need of the organism. It is a pure and luxurious consumption, gratuitous and therefore costly, an expenditure at a loss that produces a pleasure one gives oneself through the ingestive channel that is closest to the voice or orality, a pleasure of which nothing remains, a pleasure even the external signs of which are dissipated without leaving a trace, in smoke." So there's a kind of luxury to the smoking of tobacco, where you imagine maybe you're sitting around smoking a cigar or smoking a cigarette, lounging in a chair, doing nothing, maybe having a conversation, listening to music, or something else. This is a kind of similar vibe to the pieces that we're going to be talking about today, except instead of tobacco, it's opium or hashish or alcohol, but also other things like poetry or virtue. So there's it's not just an image of sitting around and doing nothing and getting high that these pieces are exploring, but the figure of intoxication also comes to stand in for a kind of artistic or even a poetic pleasure. So basically we're talking about a question of pleasure. Another word for that is hedonism. We could turn back to the Oxford English Dictionary and they define hedonism as the doctrine or theory of ethics in which pleasure is regarded as the chief good or the proper end of action. So in other words, for hedonism or hedonists, the most important thing in life is to feel pleasure, is to feel good. And so the first thing to note if we're discussing intoxication in these little pieces by Baudelaire is that it is a question of pleasure, first and foremost, that is being sought. And we'll see the different ways in which that manifests in these three different pieces. So we're going to look at these three pieces, but in fact, Baudelaire wrote quite a lot about intoxication and ideas of intoxication. He wrote a whole book, for instance, called Artificial Paradises, which consists of an essay called The Poem of Hashish and An Opium Eater. And these essays were influenced in turn by an earlier work called Confessions of an English Opium Eater. As the name Artificial Paradises implies, the idea with these discussions of intoxication is that you are going to produce an experience of paradise artificially. You're going to find paradise within earthly life and pursue the height of pleasure while you're alive. It's the hedonist philosophy. And that obviously ties in with notions of decadence, in that many decadents were accused of being hedonists, being guided by no morals, and only pursuing pleasure for its own sake. Other groups of people sought this pleasure in art. And from these people, you get an offshoot, a related movement called aestheticism, which are the people that talk about art for art's sake. One of those, perhaps the most important, was an English writer named Walter Potter. And he has a famous discussion that one can find at the end of his book on the Renaissance. And this passage is often cited in the context of decadence and aestheticism. So Potter wrote, "To burn always with this hard gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy is success in life. In a sense, it might even be said that our failure is to form habits, for, after all, habit is relative to a stereotyped world, and meantime it is only the roughness of the eye that makes any two persons, things, situations seem alike. While all melts under our feet, we may well grasp at any exquisite passion or any contribution to knowledge that seems by a lifted horizon to set the spirit free for a moment, or any stirring of the senses, strange dyes, strange colors and curious odors, or work of the artist's hands, or the face of one's friend. Not to discriminate every moment some passionate attitude in those about us, and in the very brilliancy of their gifts some tragic dividing force on their ways, is, on this short day of frost and sun, to sleep before evening." So that short and quite beautiful passage by Potter is meant to describe the importance of finding beauty in life and finding a pleasure in that beauty. To not do so, he says, is to sleep before evening, which is basically a nicer way to say to be dead before you're dead, to have wasted your life. For Potter and the aestheticists, as well as many of the decadents, in other words, many late 19th century European writers, the most important thing was to find beauty and pleasure in beauty. Baudelaire, on the other hand, often discusses drugs and intoxication as another form of seeking beauty in pleasure in the world. But what I want us to get out of these pieces by Baudelaire today is how this idea of intoxication in his writing is not just getting high, but it provides an image of finding beauty in the world. And so intoxication begins in Baudelaire, with things like alcohol and drugs, but then, as we'll see, it ends up focusing on questions of sensations and the senses, and the way in which even questions of poetry can intervene in our senses. So for instance, in part of Artificial Paradises, in a piece called The Poem of Hashish, Baudelaire described his own experiences of intoxication. He wrote, "It is indeed in this period of intoxication that a new delicacy, a greater acuteness in all the senses appears. Smell, sight, hearing, touch are all equally affected by this improvement. Your eyes can scan the infinite. Your ears can perceive almost imperceptible sounds amid the loudest din. It is at this point that the hallucinations begin. External objects slowly and successively assume strange appearances. They become deformed and transformed. Then come the equivocations, the mistakes, and the transpositions of ideas. Sounds are decked out in colors, and colors contain their own music." So here Baudelaire is describing a phenomenon called synesthesia, and people that experience synesthesia will often interpret one sense in terms of another. So music in terms of color, or colors in terms of music. And we'll see this idea of synesthesia reappear when we get to Baudelaire's poem Exotic Perfume. But before that, let's pick up where we left off with his piece called The Double Chamber. So The Double Chamber is a short prose poem describing the experience of ingesting laudanum, which is an old 19th century drug made with opium. And it describes the experience of a regular room being transformed into what Baudelaire describes at the beginning of this piece as a chamber that is like a reverie, a chamber truly spiritual. So this indicates that Baudelaire is treating this experience of intoxication as a kind of spiritual journey into a world that is characterized by beauty and pleasure and so forth. Just after that, he describes the chamber itself quite beautifully, and then he writes, compared with the pure dream, with an impression, unanalyzed, definite art, positive art, is a blasphemy. This is right after saying that there are no pictures hanging on the wall in the room. So here he's saying what good is art, what good is representative art when you can turn your life itself into an experience of what he calls here the pure dream, this idealized experience of beauty and pleasure. In other words, what Baudelaire is doing here is valorizing a kind of escapism. He's making an artistic description, maybe even what we might call a phenomenological description of taking drugs and becoming intoxicated in much the same way as we might understand the experience today as a kind of escapism from life, as a way to feel pleasure immediately just by ingesting a substance. So in this sense, a little bit later in the piece he writes, "The thing we name life, even in its most fortunate amplitude, has nothing in common with this supreme life with which I am now acquainted, which I taste minute by minute, second by second." But then Baudelaire goes on to specify exactly what he's trying to escape, not just life itself, but life within time. So he says, just after the words minute by minute, second by second, he says, "Not so, minutes are no more, seconds are no more, time has vanished, and eternity reigns, an eternity of delight." So here Baudelaire is describing an experience of time itself stopping and feeling pleasure within a moment that extends into eternity, this kind of fantasy of pleasure that doesn't fade over time. Moreover, if we think back to last time and some of the themes we talked about then, you might recall the notion of ennui or boredom. And this is also what time comes to represent for Baudelaire here, as well as in Be Drunken, which we'll look at in just a second. This idea of time as repetitive, as a cycle of days and nights repeating, where you do the same things over and over again. And also, you'll recall that Baudelaire is writing this piece in the mid-19th century, in the wake of some pretty important changes in the way that we came to think about time, specifically around questions of railroads and trains, what's called railway time sometimes, which is basically when it became important for clocks in different places to become synchronized so that the trains could run on time. So this idea of railway time was unifying time according to the exact same measure across life everywhere, so that it became possible for the trains to run on time. But this also means that it became possible to be late for things in much more measurable ways, for your day to be carved up much more effectively and accurately, so that you could be running from place to place to make your appointments in a way that was not necessarily as possible or as expected before. So the nature of our relationship to time was changing. Time was coming to be dominated by questions of punctuality, being there on time or not. Think about clocking in and clocking out at work, for instance. It's this kind of relationship to time that Baudelaire is writing about escaping. And at the end of The Double Chamber, he describes the moment after the drug has worn off. He writes, "Horror, I remember. Yes, this kennel, this habitation of eternal weariness is indeed my own. There is my senseless furniture, dusty and tattered, the dirty fireplace without a flame or an ember, the sad windows where the raindrops have traced runnels in the dust, the manuscripts erased or unfinished, the almanac with the sinister days marked off with a pencil." Especially this last sentence, you see that this is a return into his time, into his daily routine, into the boredom of his normal life. And this perfume of another world, whereof I intoxicated myself with a so perfected sensitiveness, alas, its place is taken by an odor of a stale tobacco smoke. So this image of a perfect, beautiful, happy world, free from time and the cares and concerns of one's self and one's daily life, has evaporated. It's literally gone up in smoke, and the stale odor of the smoke is all that remains. So again, you get this image of tobacco smoke as a pleasure that is impermanent, that is wasteful and useless, and potentially even damaging. But if in the double chamber Baudelaire is describing the use of drugs as a kind of escape from life and from time, in the short prose poem Be Drunken, he describes fairly close to the same thing, but it no longer is a question of drugs only. He broadens his idea of what intoxication can mean. He includes things like poetry and virtue as other forms of intoxicating oneself. So here again, at the beginning of this piece, Baudelaire recapitulates a lot of the same themes. He writes, "Be always drunken, nothing else matters. That is the only question. If you would not feel the horrible burden of time weighing on your shoulders and crushing you to the earth, be drunken continually." Drunken with what? With wine, with poetry, or with virtue, as you will, but be drunken. So here it matters less for Baudelaire whether you're actually talking about an actual intoxication or whether you're talking about a more metaphorical intoxication. The idea here is you're allowing yourself to be consumed by something. You're allowing yourself to lose your inhibitions and fully commit to something outside of yourself, and attempting to transport yourself into some other kind of realm of beauty and pleasure in life, whether this is an immediate bodily pleasure or a more ideal poetic kind of pleasure. So being drunken here for Baudelaire is no longer a question of drinking alcohol, for instance, or doing drugs, but anything that you do to escape the routines and habits and repetitions of your daily life, that here he signifies with the idea of time in general. So this is again how he concludes the piece. He says, "Be drunken if you would not be martyred slaves of time. Be drunken continually, with wine, with poetry, or with virtue, as you will." So how can you get drunken or intoxicated with poetry, for example? Well, that is the subject of the last piece we read for today, called Exotic Perfume. This is a poem by Baudelaire from 1857, which is another sonnet. This translation breaks up the stanzas in a way that's quite different from the original, which is structured as a more traditional sonnet, as I will show now. But in any case, it's a sonnet of 14 lines. And it's about one of the senses, in this case the sense of smell, when a particular scent sends him into this kind of poetic vision of pleasure and restfulness and delight. So the poem reads, "On autumn nights, eyes closed, when, sensuous, I breathe the scent of your warm breasts, my sight is peopled by far shores happy and bright, under a sun warm and monotonous. A lazy isle which nature, generous, stocks with weird trees and fruits of strange delight, men with lithe bodies, powerful but slight, women whose candid eyes flash luminous. Urged by your scent to such charmed lands at last, I see a port with many a sail and mast, still weary from the ocean's frenzied roll, while the green tamarinds exhale their savor to please my nostrils with a dulcet flavor, mingled with sailor shanties in my soul." So here you get a poem that's very sensuous, and it's a lot like the synesthesia that he describes in Artificial Paradises and elsewhere, where one sense gives rise to all of the others. So in this case, a scent or a perfume gives rise to this whole poetic universe characterized by the other senses, this kind of island paradise that he describes in the poem. So here he's intoxicated with his own senses. So he hasn't even taken any drugs here, but by attuning himself to his senses in a kind of poetic way, he's able to create this whole world out of his, maybe partly his memory and his imagination. So perhaps you've also had this experience where you smell something that you haven't smelled in a while, and this smell can transport you to a memory that you've long forgotten and make it really vivid again. It's a kind of similar experience here that he's describing, where a smell that he smells opens up this whole world for him in his imagination. and he becomes intoxicated by it even without having taken any drugs. This seems to be what he means when he talks about poetic drunkenness. So he begins the poem with his eyes closed, unable to see anything, but as soon as he inhales this scent, his sight awakens even though his eyes are closed, and he's transported into this island scene where there's a nice warm summer sun beating down on a lazy isle. It's important to note that this is a lazy isle, again, because what he's depicting here is a kind of vacation scene, free from the world of work, free from the obligations that come along with time, of being on time, of getting things done on time, and that sort of thing. There are beautiful men and women wandering around this island. There are weird trees and fruits of strange delight. So trees with fruits of strange delight probably is recalling a bit the idea of forbidden fruit. And in the last half of the poem, he describes a port on this island with ships that have come in, still wearied by their time at sea, which here we might again think about in terms of time, in terms of the march of time and the toll it takes on us. Here on this island, you are safe from that, and your ship has come into harbor, and even though you are still weary from the ocean's frenzied roll, as Baudelaire put it, your ship has come to rest and on this kind of paradise island. And then he evokes the sense of smell one more time, while the green tamarinds exhale their savor to please my nostrils with a dulcet flavor. A tamarind is a tree that produces fruits that are used in various cuisines around the world. It's used a lot in Indian cuisine, for example. And then finally, the last line of the poem, mingled with sailor shanties in my soul. The scent of the tamarind trees comes to mingle with the sounds of sailor shanties. So those are songs that he hears, and they resonate within his soul. So here again, you have a mixing up of the senses, a kind of synesthesia, in this case of scent with sound. So all of these things, the warm sun, the sounds of the songs, the beautiful smells, and the beautiful sights on the island come to intoxicate the poet. And all of these images are produced on the basis of a single scent that he smells at the beginning of the poem, and that he kind of allows to poetically resonate within him and produce all of these poetic images. So this would be one example of what he might mean by the idea of getting intoxicated or getting drunk on poetry. And so the figure of intoxication in Baudelaire comes to mean a lot of different things. It sometimes is given in an image of a kind of decadent, morally dissolute, lazy person sitting around, getting high, such as you see in The Double Chamber. But then it can also describe this kind of poetic impulse, this idea of using poetry to change how you view the world, like you see in Exotic Perfume. So the figure of intoxication has different values in Baudelaire at different points in his writing. And it should of course go without saying that reading these figures of intoxication in Baudelaire is not an endorsement of drugs and getting intoxicated, but it does go to show how varied the figure of intoxication can be, even within Baudelaire's own writing, and certainly in other 19th century and late 19th century pieces of literature, such as we even saw with Walter Potter's discussion of this idea of escaping from habit and embracing your senses as a kind of form of poetic intoxication. So for the written work, which will be due on Tuesday, I'll just ask you to write at least a paragraph exploring some of these themes of intoxication in these three pieces by Baudelaire, perhaps comparing and contrasting them, and trying to draw out their different aspects. Next week, we'll talk about another important decadent work, which is the play Salome by Oscar Wilde, and we'll see a lot of these themes that we've talked about in Verlaine and Baudelaire and Potter and others reappear there in some interesting ways. So please read that over the weekend, and we will talk about that play next week.